You're listening to In Bad Company. My guest today is Ric Mixter, Emmy-nominated filmmaker and Great Lakes shipwreck researcher who dived over 100 wrecks, including the Edmund Fitzgerald. We'll be talking about the Fitzgerald story and how Gordon Lightfoot's song helped make it infamous. Ric Mixter, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing so well. It's a busy time of year, obviously, with shipwrecks and stories and such, and
Yeah,
doing great.
that's awesome. So have you been called Indiana Jones many times, or is that more of a rare thing?
Keith, I have been so blessed with an amazing career as a journalist, where a lot of the guys would get sick if they flew in airplanes, so I got all the assignments to do that. I covered a shipwreck that exploded in Bay City. For 2 nights, we watched this thing burn, and that launched my maritime career. And it's all been tied together. So when people look at the scope of what I've done, they look like, oh, you're the most interesting man in the world. And I look at it like,
Mm,
no, I've been the most lucky. I've flown F-16s. I have over 100 hours in B-52s. I've flown literally to Europe and back and never landed on bombers. And then the maritime stuff is just an extra plus. So Indiana
yeah.
Jones is a wonderful thing, but I'm not an archaeologist. I don't have a cool
Yeah.
hat, but I love wearing a flight suit. I love wearing a wetsuit. And if those are the only 2 suits I ever wear, I'll be very, very lucky.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's fun. Yeah, your videos are fun. Your lectures, I think you're such an engaging person. It's a cool way to get people excited about this stuff because you're excited about it. And I think that's very contagious. So,
And wouldn't you know,
uh,
some people still fall asleep in my talks.
oh, it's the worst. Well, I wonder if you could just kind of start off by telling us a little bit about what you do. I mean, you mentioned some things. So yeah, what's the scope?
I started when I was 16 in radio and professionally as a DJ, and it exploded into television. I did a telethon for Jerry's Kids. So the TV station said, "Do you want to be a reporter?" And it just threw me into this broadcast world that, I really thought I should go to college to do. And I did after 3 years of professional broadcasting and found out that I didn't really need college. So I went to ABC and Flint and worked my way in and became a producer and a storyteller. And that became, once I got tired of the news, I went into creating my own videos for 20 years. And that launched me into the PBS world where I could now do longer than 1 minute stories on the news. I could do 60-minute documentaries. So that's led to incredible adventures, incredible encounters with people who are heroic, who survive shipwrecks, and people who flew helicopter missions to pull guys off shipwrecks. I mean, it's just been an amazing career.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Like, I think the deeper you dive into what you've been able to be a part of is just it's awe-inspiring. It's just so fun, and it's cool to see that you're so passionate about that. Um, so we're here, I mean, we're talking primarily about the Edmund Fitzgerald. It's the 50th. I was wondering if we could hear from you, like, what is the story of this shipwreck?
In a nutshell, it was the largest object ever launched into fresh water in 1958. It was an investment by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. So they put $8 million in and they made their money back. This ship became known as the Toledo Express. It was not only running from Detroit to Silver Bay and Burlington Northern at Superior, but most of its runs were Toledo to Silver Bay. And this is where Northwest Mutual had investments in. So they were more than covered their costs. The problem is Fitzgerald had some flaws, and they found this in the keel that it broke. And in many interviews I did, the ship just did not sail right in heavy seas. Enter a captain who just never missed a storm. In fact, the Weather Bureau said the Fitzgerald was the boat that made it in the most storms. And in 1975, he went through 5 gales before one finally bested him. And that's inspired a guy in Canada to write a song about it. And that's why we still talk about it.
Yeah. I was going to say, you mentioned before we started the pod, so there's this very, Gordon Lightfoot song, and that you maybe have some reservations about that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, Gordon was finishing up Summertime Dream, his album, and he had read in Newsweek, November the Cruelest Month. It was just a 2-paragraph, 5-paragraph note that was in Newsweek, a story written by two guys in Detroit, and half of their facts were wrong about not only that storm, but the 13 storm. And so he created this incredible story with amazing lyrics like, Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the wave turns the minutes to hours? That's incredible. But then he totally missed on the ship. There are no mills in Wisconsin. It was not fully loaded for Cleveland. The old cook was not on board. There is no Chippewa legend about Lake Superior giving up its dead. And this has all been taken in as fact. And I feel bad, Heath, when people, quote these things that he sings in the song and say that they know about the Fitzgerald when, it was bound partially loaded for Detroit and so many other things. The old cook had gotten off because his feet were hurting him, and I interviewed him. So a lot of the
Mm.
stories we've been slowly correcting, but I will tell you, so many people tell me, Rick, it was just a song, let it go.
Yeah.
But if 90% of the people take all of our maritime history from that one song, at least let's get it right. And he changed the lyrics, which killed me. He changed it about the hatches because so many of the families had told him it wasn't my son that sank it, and it wasn't their son, but the hatches did sink the Fitzgerald, and for him to change that and not change Fully Loaded for Cleveland seemed a little silly.
Hmm. More of a like trying to appease some people, but still doesn't
You should
get
have
a
seen
facts right.
he ended up going to Mariners Church, and if you remember the song, he called it a musty old church in Detroit. That church is not musty. It's an amazing little church. It sits right next to the Renaissance Center, and they just, glared him down, so he changed that one to rustic old church. So, yeah, I think pressure made him change it, not facts, other than the fact that it's not musty at Detroit.
Right. That's interesting. So he got more inspired from the idea of it, not the actual.
The
He,
pressure, yeah, the pressure from people looking at him going, "Hey," and maybe I should have done a better job of pressuring him into changing the other stuff. But, again, it is ultimately just a song, and,
yeah.
I hope that people use that as a launching point to learn more about our history. We have 300 years of maritime history on the Great Lakes, started with LaSalle, who lost 2 ships. The very 2 first sailing ships on the Great Lakes were lost as shipwrecks, and they have incredible stories. And most of the bigger storms, there were 12 storms that were much worse than the Edmund Fitzgerald storm, one that took 260 lives. If you listen to the song and you get launched into watching one of my documentaries or any of the incredible books or podcasts that are out there, that's a good thing if you learn more. But if you just stop there, yeah, that would be a travesty.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully that's what the reaction is, that people are interested in the story and do the actual research and figure that out as well. Um, I always think about it a lot with like the movie Jaws. I'm a big fan. Also 1975. Um, and some people reacted by going to hunt sharks after that. And then some people are like, actually, that started my love of marine biology. It's like, well, there's different ways to react.
There is, and now, we get all those crazy headlines that we are running out of sharks, and now all of a sudden, that's all you get are sharks. I
Yeah.
think that you see a balance and a lot of false information that comes out. They weren't completely cutting all the sharks up into fin soup the way we would hear about from documentaries. So yeah, a lot of false come out, even on the shipwreck stories too, as well. And that's what really kind of pushed Gordon into changing the lyrics was a silly video that came out of Canada that somehow this was the storm of the century, and nothing could be more further from the truth.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting, especially at that time. I wonder, so you talked to him, did he, I mean, I'm assuming he didn't think this was a huge song. He was just like, "Oh yeah, I just wanted another one for the album," or
Yeah, and I never met him. I was very lucky, and I
oh,
love
okay.
music, obviously being a DJ. It would have been great to talk to him about, these things, but not with our differences. I don't think it would have been right for me to stand up. I don't like when people correct me in the audience. I can't
Right.
imagine, how thrilled he would be. And if we look at the other big history song that was on the radio, Bye Bye Miss American Pie about a tragic plane crash, they just touch on it. So it's part of it's not supposed to be a documentary. I get that, but when you change your lyrics because of peer pressure, it's almost like ripping down the statues of what we've seen recently. You might disagree with what that represents. That doesn't mean you get to go and ruin it, you know? So I think that it should open a discussion for people. And maybe it should be taken out of maybe the public plaza, but not destroyed just because it hurts your feelings.
Yeah. Wow. Man, that really reminds me, I got an opportunity to go to Germany and just seeing all like the Nuremberg buildings. And they're like, we don't take care of them because of what they represented, but we're not tearing them down because we want to remember. And I'm like, man, even if you disagree, obviously statues are different, but what a powerful way to be like, we're gonna sit with this. We're gonna watch that and
Right,
we
and the
need to
locals
remember.
don't wanna talk about it. My sister is, transitioning not transitioning, becoming a German, so she has lived there forever, and it's just not something you go around and talk about, Hitler or any of that stuff, and I think we kinda choke now at, when we call our leader a fascist or Hitler and stuff because we know how bad that means to us, but, many of us historians just go, "Yeah, you don't know, what you're talking about. I know you're just trying to be mean, but, yeah, in Germany, you don't talk much about that, but it does still exist. And the stalags and the prison camps, especially what happened to the Jews, should not be forgotten. And I think as we diminish that by, using that as something to call somebody else, it just seems a little silly.
Yeah. Yeah, I also have a movie podcast and we were talking about Star Wars and somebody commented that Kathleen Kennedy, the head of Lucasfilm, was Hitler. And I was like, okay, that's ridiculous. Like that's too far. Like what are you talking about?
Yeah, it was enough to call people Satan. It was good enough to call people, but when you start getting into the history of what these people represented and how many millions of people they had exterminated, that's not fair. And I get it,
Yeah.
you're just trying to use it, but we put a lot of power into words. I know I'm way off topic on shipwrecks now, but it just seems silly for a historian to hear, these stories and just blown out of perspective, that America somehow was all for slavery for a while, and you look at all the states that weren't and stuff, and we still have these problems today because we don't have an open dialogue, or we teach a microcosm of what that whole story was because we don't have time to tell the whole story. And that unfortunately, makes it look really worse than, it was horrible, but to think of how many people fought against it, how many of my relatives fought against slavery, it seems a little silly to still be dealing with these issues.
Yeah. Yeah, it really does. Um yeah, it's really interesting to see too. And I think that's one of my passions with starting this podcast specifically is it's AI proof because it's people and their stories. And it's like if we lose that, we're in big trouble. So
And they're all
um
perspectives. You gotta remember that
mhm.
too, that everything I say is a perspective. I've been
Yeah.
lucky to interview over 30 years the people that built the Fitzgerald, the people that sailed the Fitzgerald, the people who dove the Fitzgerald, and the ones who, not only looked for it with airplanes, but looked for it with a Coast Guard cutter. And all of that stuff becomes my opinion, but all of my stuff is based on eyewitness stuff, not what I read or what I think it should be or what I don't believe. I usually take the opinions of many other people, and that's how I try to form what I think is true. And I don't eliminate other stuff. I just say, this is probably not true, but this is why I believe that. So if you back that up, I think that you can allow people to come to their own conclusion rather than being an influencer and telling them this is exactly how you should believe and everything else is nonsense. And that's where we get that horrible conflict on the internet, which we shouldn't have, is that people can be anonymous and still, blast people for with no facts, and that seems a little silly.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Um well, I guess yeah, bringing it back to the Fitzgerald, like what first drew you to this story?
I grew up in Marquette, and I was born on the air base not far from there, and we'd ride our bikes to the ore docks, and we watch the ships load. We'd swim in Lake Superior or the rock quarries if it was too cold. Sometimes Lake Superior would be, 38 degrees, and we wouldn't go in there. But the history was always important. A stop at the Peter White Library to read the Fred Stonehouse books was always interesting. but it didn't really catch. My buddy was a scuba diver. He'd swim in the quarry and around the ore docks with his scuba gear on. But I was the oldest of 7 kids. We had 10 people in a trailer, and it was never going to be that I would be able to afford scuba lessons until I covered a story of the Jupiter exploding. And I was there, and we got scooped, because a guy was a diver. And my boss said, "Why aren't you a diver?" And I said, "Because you haven't paid for it yet." And the TV station paid for my scuba lessons. So in 91, I became certified, borrowed a camera, filmed an incredible series of shipwrecks up by Thunder Bay, Alpena, won several awards, and then the station was excited. Let's go do more scuba. So I started finding survivors from 1913, 1940, and that just turned into documentaries and big stories that I eventually went off and did on my own. So it launched from an interest as a kid, but the shipwreck of the Jupiter really put me on the deck of a shipwreck, a melted shipwreck, where I could become just engrossed in the history and want to know more. And that's when the opportunity to dive the Fitzgerald came along after I'd done a documentary on the 1913 storm. So it wasn't like I didn't know about shipwrecks, but I certainly didn't know enough about the Fitzgerald. And I could kick myself now, hour and a half down on the bottom on, at Lake Superior. And I really didn't know much what to look for. And now I wish I'd get that opportunity again.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's so crazy. So looking back, you were like, I wish I would have known, or I had what to
And
look
you
at.
couldn't, the books, and that's why I wrote my book, Telltale Sounds, is because the books are good, but they're just reimaginations of the Coast Guard report. And all of that stuff is very public knowledge. And by going through the actual recordings, audio recordings and the video recordings the Coast Guard made, you can see obvious mistakes that were made, where they put a lot of heavy influence on the hatches being, the reason it sank. And you can imagine what that was like. And then getting access to the 89 footage, the ROV survey, and putting together all those details, it gives me more insight than just what I saw from our dive. 16 hours on the bottom in 1994 from the Delta submersible. And then I've seen footage from the Clelia and the bell raising, and all of that stuff has become my knowledge base that, quite frankly, nobody else has had access to all of that. It took me 30 years to get it. It took me
Yeah.
almost 5 years just to get a picture of the Jacques Cousteau submarine, because the society did not want to work with me on anything. And, don't leave that challenge to a reporter. I found out that Westinghouse had an opportunity to tear the sub apart and ride in it. So I found all the footage, all the pictures I needed, and gladly sent a copy to the society.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. And so I mean, that's part of a lot of what you do, is just like that research and just seeking that stuff out. That's gotta be really, I don't know, it's gotta be tiring, I'm sure, but just a lot very invigorating as well.
Never tiring, because it's always a slow process. It's not like you take it all at once, but you get little nibbles of where you can go. And the internet has changed over 30 years to now where we used to have to go through microfiche and look at every page. And many of the ship stories would be buried even in the cartoon section. So you had to look at every darn page and
Wow.
try to find information. Now I just type in the name of the shipwreck, the Plymouth, for my messages in the bottle of my book called Bottle Goodbyes. And everything that ever was printed about the schooner Plymouth, as long as you put schooner in front of it in quotes, so you're not getting everything on Plymouth Rock and all the other Plymouths that we had, farm Plymouths, you narrow that down, and now you've got access beyond the wildest imagination of people who used to search. Now the internet has made it very easy, but it's also polluted a lot too, with a lot of, misinformation as well.
Yeah. So when you're diving, the Fitzgerald or some of these other wrecks, like what's some of the feelings that go through you? What are some of the thoughts?
I went through every emotion you can possibly think of, and some of them, I think people would be not embarrassed, but it's embarrassing to say you were excited to go dive where people had died. But the truth is, Gordon Lightfoot made this vessel into a legend. It's the largest ship ever lost in the Great Lakes. It's deep, it's 550 feet down. So nobody gets access. At the time, I think we had less than 24 people that had seen it, maybe a little less than that. By the time the bell came up, now that list is in the 50s, somewhere around there, because of all the submarines that were involved. But limited amount of people had seen it. So ecstatic to go down, nervous to get inside a submarine, but I also had to film all of the exterior shots of the submarine. So I put my wetsuit on and jumped into the water and actually filmed, in freezing cold water, all the pictures of the submarine. So we had references of the plaque that we brought down, or the Fred Shannon, the guy that actually paid for the expedition, him in the porthole looking, all that stuff had to be filmed. So the submarine, when I got in, I shut they locked the hatch. Dave Slater closed it. And I didn't have to worry about pressure. I didn't have to worry about narcosis or decompression, which is all diving things. The temperature, I wore a sweatshirt, even though I went down to the very bottom where it was 37 degrees, and didn't have a problem with that part of it. So the nerves went away. And then when you started seeing things on the bottom, like screwdrivers and a coffee cup with the Columbia logo on it, blankets,
Wow.
and the weather tarps hanging out of the windows, and out off the rail, and you realize this is a place where men lived and worked and died. And then you go to this sadness. And right after my dive, within, 40 minutes of the submarine coming up, the tug owner and his son went down. He was going to write a report for his middle school. He lived in Canada, and they found a missing crewman wearing a life vest on the bottom. So now we're at this super depression of, oh my God, no one had ever seen a body down there. What are we going to do about notifying the police, notifying the Ministry of Canada, because the shipwreck is 750 feet across the border in Canada, waters, they control that. So sadness, scared about what's going to happen. Would it cancel our mission, even though we were only a day into it? And it just elation too, that, quite frankly, the story, the song goes, the Chippewa have said that the lake never gives up its dead, and 5 expeditions had never seen anything, including the Coast Guard, and we found a body. There's a certain amount of pride that goes into a reporter breaking one of the biggest stories in Michigan history. And I don't take that lightly. I know there's been some amazing history, but I've seen 3 stations that said within the top 10 stories, the body on the Fitzgerald was one of them. So to break that story is a big point of pride. So many of these emotions, I'm sad that, as I tell people about them, that people would think, oh my God, 29 guys died there. But I have to admit, there's all this stuff that goes through it. And if it was all profound sadness, I would never do shipwreck stories, because that's the sad outcome of 1913, that 260 people died, or 60 people died in 1940. I would never do these stories if it was all based on that. There's so much more behind the story. And in many places, especially Fitzgerald, the people who went to go rescue them, the heroism that happened during those hours, that's the things that I focus in on, not the fact that we ring the bell 29 times.
Hmm. Yeah, it's everything around it, right? It's learning about the Great Lakes, the rescuers, house ships, and then hopefully we're learning from that of, what to do in the future. And
We do, and I'll be honest, we didn't learn a lot. People are
mm,
quick to credit, "Oh, man, we've got, Gumby suits or the big survival suits." That stuff, every shipping company fought. They told them that, it just ran aground, let's just forget about it. They didn't wanna make any of the modifications the Coast Guard told them. They didn't wanna haul less cargo in the winter because the Coast Guard felt the hatches weren't secure, and they proved this with ride-alongs. They do surprise ride-alongs on freighters, and 80% of them didn't dog down their hatches. So the big change was the pressure put on these shipping companies, and really on the captains, who this Captain McSorley made horrible decisions. The biggest ship on the Great Lakes, a 1,000-footer was in the river system, but the 800-foot Blau went and hid behind Isle Royal during this storm. So bad decisions were made. And since that time, maybe people have taken the Fitzgerald as being a warning to say, I thought my ship was infallible, which is what the captain of the Anderson said in an interview. I didn't think I could be sunk. And the reality is the Fitzgerald went down, and that was 729 feet long. So I
Huh.
think change that. Then we did see incredible changes, within 15 to 20 years of buoy systems that report real time. We now have cameras on buoys that we can see what's happened in the middle of Lake Superior. Satellites now unprecedented. They had one satellite in 1975. Today, there's networks that we can see the weather in high definition. It's unbelievable how much more survivable it is with EPIRBs that track people who go into life rafts that launch right from the deck. So much better than Fitzgerald's, rubber rafts that were found partially deflated and nobody in them. So I think that it's much more survivable, and I think the attitude has changed too. But it's hard to just credit the Fitzgerald for that.
Right. Yeah. It's that the whole history, I guess.
And the fact that things still happen, we've lost several smaller vessels, and we've had the biggest vessel, the Paul Tregurtha, run aground. So people still make bad decisions. The Coast Guard had two of their ships. One collided with a vessel. The Mackinac, brand new, ran into the pier. So it still happens as long as there's people running these things or bad software. We're gonna
Yeah.
have and Mother Nature's not gonna give up either. We'll always see bigger waves, and big storms, and that's all changing too.
Hmm. And then just to clarify real quick, so the body you found that was not related to the Fitzgerald or wasn't part of that crew.
Well,
Is that
this is the
correct?
problem, is that we found him, off of the port side near an open door in the pilot house. He was wearing a vest made out of cork and, had overalls on, and that's all we've really released. We got very close, filmed everything that was part of our license with the Canadian government, was anything that we find, we were going to document and get it out. To our credit, none of those close-ups, none of our descriptions beyond coveralls ever got out, even though the headlines just roasted us as pirates and how dare you talk about a body on the bottom, but the 29 guys had vanished in 1975. That was the story. Where did they go? And then we found one of them outside the shipwreck. So there were some people that said, well, the vest was so decomposed, we don't think it was from Fitzgerald. But it's so close, and the more modern coveralls, I put 99% that it came from the Edmund Fitzgerald, and that you don't see somebody just sink with a life jacket on. He was drugged down. That's why the cork didn't float. That's why it's crushed down there 500 feet down. The air bubbles inside cork do not float at that depth, so they stay right in place. And it's a tragic thing. I mean, we can pretty much tell who it was, but we've never said who it is because that's distasteful, and that is a gravesite. And we knew we would catch heck from people about, talking about such things, but that's the reality of this. And when we dove the largest ship, second largest ship on the lakes and the largest in Lake Michigan, the Carl Bradley, everybody's like, oh, you're going to film bodies. No, there wasn't a Chippewa legend about the lake never giving up its dead. On the Bradley, two men survived. That's the story, is the Sundew
Hmm.
rescuing them. The story isn't, a mysterious god or whatever that would take these lives and trap them in the shipwreck, and then we found something. So it was one of those things that, as a journalist, you don't skip it, you don't not mention it because it'll hurt somebody's feelings, but you try to be ethical about how you tell that story. And I think we did a great job. Only 300 copies of that video were ever sold. And that was largely because the Michigan government tried to ban, its viewing of it. And it, again, completely against our First Amendment, but nobody bothered to say anything about that, when they passed the law. So it was silly. But now the law has been struck down. So that's all water under the bridge. But at the time,
Hmm.
as a journalist, I was pretty angry about it.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's crazy. That you think that stuff. I don't know. For me, as the outside perspective, it feels like that stuff just doesn't happen. It's like we know stuff, we're told stuff, and then it's like, oh,
Well, and then that was amidst, Heath, that was amidst coverage of Desert Storm with all kinds of dead bodies, and the horribleness of what war is. And for them to say, oh, we don't want to show this Fitzgerald body, and then to have the pressure coming from a museum that I'm now on the board of directors of. But at the time, they were like, you shouldn't film that body. But they had a documentary showing in there about a ring they took off of a dead skeleton down there. How hypocritical is that? To be criticizing just because there's still people alive who would be sad about this. Who speaks for the other shipwrecks that are 100 years old? And I bring the same respect. to all 100 shipwrecks I've dove that are 120, 140 years old where people died. The same respect to the Fitzgerald that at the time was only 25 years old. So I didn't lose a lot of sleep over people trying to criticize what my ethics were. I knew what they were, and I knew that we did a good job on it, but it was still challenging. And even to this day, there's still people that will write me nasty grams, want me to resign my board position at Whitefish because I don't follow what all the family members say. And I can only be Ric, and I'm just a human being that can make bad decisions too. And I won't say that I made all great ones, but I think it holds its own even 25 years later from when we did that story.
Yeah. Did it give any family members like some peace? Did you hear anything like
Some
that
that
or?
wasn't the loudest voices, as you know, so much. The vocal minority are the ones that we hear in the news all the time. And it used to be that as a journalist, you would be an ethical gatekeeper. You'd come in and you decide that guy's loud or that gal's loud. But they're not right. So we're not going to put that on. And that all changes with the internet. Now it's whoever yells the loudest gets a chapter, and it's not fair if they're not right. So and the voices that I heard from, we heard some people, and the Champeau brothers wanted us to cut a hole in the ship and go get their crew, the crew member that was lost. And I get that. We were visited at the church by one of the family members too, and we didn't talk to him. We left it very respectful. It was a church, and they were reflecting on their loved one that was lost. But other than that, I really haven't had a lot of contact until recently, the last 10 or 15 years. Pam Johnson, the cook on board, the temporary cook, Bob Rafferty's daughter, and I have a very good friendship, and we talk all the time, and that's fun. And she would like to find things, but I don't think a lot of them want us to go back. It's still a grave site, and they're very sensitive. But the truth is, this is a crime scene investigation. How many shows on TV right now are CSI? At least 100 of them. People
Yeah.
are interested in what happened. Why did these people lose their lives? And we still haven't come to the bottom of that. And I think those clues are down there simply because of the 6 expeditions. No one did a fantastic job of laying out a map of where all the cargo is, where all the hatches are. And I think with a visit, we could do that. The body part of it, that's all, again, that's been done. No one would go back to that area anyways because it's so taboo. That's not part of it. But to ignore that in 1994 when we found it would have been just as bad. No journalist in the world would have said, "Oh, I'm not going to talk about this because so many family members will be hurt by it." But, it still didn't stop the flames that came out.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate. The loud voices are what we hear for sure. I don't know, it seems to me I've never been in that situation, obviously, but then just that idea of some closure, some idea of, something would be beneficial. So, and I'm sure people felt that, even if you
And
didn't hear it,
remember, I've done what, 4 books now, and I've done 30 programs for PBS on shipwrecks. And every one of those other stories, a family member from the Davik wanted to know what happened to Captain Billy. The people on the Novadoc want to know the story of what happened to their loved one, Howard Goldsmith. And I did an interview with him, surviving 126-mile-an-hour winds, twice that of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So all of them want to know more, but there were 3 or 4 very vocal family members who have since passed, that did not want anybody to talk about it except for Whitefish Point Museum. That was where the bell was, and that's the only spokespeople. And that was a travesty of, the knowledge that was out there on the shipwreck. They were canceling functions for friends of mine that wanted to do tributes to the Fitzgerald, and they would call up the city and go, "My son died on this," or "My brother died." And who deserves that power? I don't see where anybody should be able to have the power to shut that down, but they did. So those voices have been silenced. I think that that's sad that we don't still have them around to see some of the changes that are going on. But I'm also very pleased that they weren't very rational. It was all do what we say and that's it. And every November they would be asked, "What do you think about this?" And they would be given a channel or a microphone, and it never turned out in a positive to do it. So the Canadian government just basically, eliminates the possibility of going down there by controlling the permits. So will it change? Yeah, I think it will change. I think 50 years is a long time. The law they passed in Michigan was only for 50-year shipwrecks. So now even the categorization of the Fitzgerald doesn't even fit into the law that they illegally passed. That law was challenged when a journalist covered a plane crash and filmed a body on there and thought he could use the Fitzgerald law to get him in trouble for filming the body. And of course, it immediately came out, no, you can't tell us what we can film and what we can't. And the prosecutor up in Charlevoix had to issue an apology to the journalist, and that law was pretty much struck down. So it would take a while for us to get our vengeance, not vengeance, our equity on that injustice that was done. We weren't going to challenge it monetarily. It's too costly to take on the state, to challenge that. But ultimately, the truth came out.
Hmm. And what is that law you're referring to? Is it's the amount of time a ship has to be?
Immediately, the two vocal family members called Bart Stupak, one of our congressmen. He said, I can't handle this, but take it to a state level. So Pat Gagliardi passed the law based out of the UPs from Drummond, and they started movement right away on you can't film any body on a shipwreck or in a mine shaft that's less than 50 years old. And that was very
Hmm.
clearly only the Edmund Fitzgerald, right? But they couldn't pass it anyways because the Fitzgerald wasn't in Michigan waters. But they still got this law through. I called Lansing and I said, I'm the guy that's writing the documentary. I'm the guy that's making the decision of what footage goes into it. Should I talk to you? And they're like, oh, no, we got it covered. We don't need you to come here. They'd already made up their minds that they were going to pass this, even though right away, whenever you bring a law in, the lawyers of the state look at it and say, no, that's unconstitutional. They didn't care. They had family members that were telling them to seal it off. And if they all patted themselves on the back saying, oh, look at, we passed a law that had no meaning other than to heavily criticize and shame our expedition and our video to a point where it wouldn't sell. So legally, it did nothing. But when you're getting press releases from Bart Stupak and the former state senator, about how shameful it was for us to film this sailor. Wait a minute, that's ridiculous that anybody would do that. But we've got the paperwork. I've got the press releases that came out of their offices, and yeah, it happened. So yeah, but it didn't stop anything. It's the most talked about part of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Even beyond the song, it's part of the story, and it's grown into its own legend of multiple bodies being out there or why it was covered up. And I look at these things on Reddit and stuff and just laugh because I was, the decision maker on all of that stuff. So I know it's not true.
Yeah. I was gonna say, have you heard the theory that it was an alien? That's why you haven't shown the footage yet?
And somebody asked me, they said, well, we want to truth that story about National Enquirer. And I'm like, I don't know how you would. The copies aren't online like so many. Like you can get any copy of Newsweek or you can find all the stories in Time. But Enquirer is such trash that there's not even a place that you can go. You could get a back issue. And I think it was mentioned in September of 76 or January of 76 is where the alien story came up that I can trace it to, but I have not found the article. But that, it's obvious silliness, but that's why Gordon looked at this story. How would a ship in 1958, the Bradley went down. 2 people survived, and most of the bodies were recovered. In 1966, Dennis Hale was in his underwear and a pea coat and made it through 2 nights, November 28th, 1966, survived on a life raft, and everybody around him froze to death, but they found the majority of the crew. So how in 1975 did 29 guys vanish and nobody knows where they went? Not a single body was found. Not a mayday was sent out. That built such a immediate legend that Gordon wrote the song, and then that propelled it into now infamy that, we hear that song every November and we're reminded. And it really launched what I do. If he didn't do that song, I don't know that there'd be that much interest in doing talks about lighthouses and shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, the way I can do 50 of these lectures a year and repeated ones at different locations. I don't think that would have happened without Gordon. So I owe him an homage, a salute and a thank you. But I'm also highly critical that, some of that stuff was very incorrect and should have been corrected.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, the song was my first introduction to that shipwreck. I was probably 12 and we went to that museum on Lake Superior and they played that song. And for a kid who didn't care much about the ships at the time, it's like, man, that song stuck with you. And like, what was that about? And it's just, you hear it and you look more and
It's impressive too, that song was not embraced right away. The thought was by the family members in 1976, this song went to number 2 on the charts. The only reason it didn't make number 1 was because of Rod Stewart. Tonight's the Night was a song, a love song that no way was he gonna beat it. So, sadly, it didn't hit number 1, even though it went into the top position near, November when all the stories were being generated a year after the big fits had been lost. So, the whole I think that whole, you know, legendary status of it, kind of ignited at that point, but it has just stayed on. But sailors immediately and the family members thought that he was making millions of dollars on it, and they were upset. In fact, I'd sailed with a guy that was a third mate on board the, Fitzgerald when I took a trip on the Wolverine, and he said, "That damn song," and he was so mad about, how Gordon made money and how it was constantly reminding his family of how dangerous it was out on the lakes. It is dangerous and it should be respected just the same way as an airplane pilot, or the more dangerous thing I do is riding on these crazy highways near Detroit. That's where you take your life, at risk much more than going out on the Great Lakes. But the song really definitely put it there. And people were not excited about it at first until Gordon started inviting the family members for free concerts, and then all of a sudden he became the patron saint of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So the turnaround was just as impressive, even though you don't see him giving millions of dollars to any maritime museums or the Mariners Church or anything like that. It just never happened. So it was good
mm,
PR for sure.
yeah, that's interesting. You kind of realize like, hey, there's a better way to connect with this. And yeah. Hmm. So, what has your perspective? I mean, it sounds like we talked a little bit about this with just like you didn't know what to look for when you're even down there, but how has your perspective changed in the past, few decades
It's
on this
it's been
ship?
incredible access, going into hearing Cooper's full interview from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, and that took, me growing my name to a big enough name that I could be invited to join the board of directors at the museum. So all of that evolution, all that knowledge of the other storms, has definitely created, an industry for me. 4 books now, 30 PBS shows on shipwrecks, endless podcasts that I do on shipwreckpodcast.com. I do a ton of stuff in magazines, I think 10 Michigan history magazines. All that has changed my perspective. And it changes by allowing me to eliminate so many of the theories, especially on the Fitzgerald's loss. Did it run aground? There's only one person in the entire world that thought it did, and that was Captain Cooper. And even though he thought the ship was closer to Caribou than it should have been, he still went to bed afterwards. So automatically shows you that he did not really believe that they had hit bottom. He just, after hearing the damage at 3:30, and then of course the vessel vanishing at 7:10, started to tie it all together. And the shipping companies loved that idea. Captain McSorley made a bad call, hit the island, and lost. And now McSorley's dead. The ship's gone. That's the end of the story. So when the Coast Guard started coming up with hatch theories and stuff, they're like, "Hey, you can't charge us billions of dollars in lost cargo and billions of dollars of modifications in the ships that when McSorley made the mistake." So they love that whole Cooper theory, even though in my book there's 20 reasons it didn't run aground. They would have had the time to go into the area. That would have been bad. 6 Fathom Shoal does not exist. It was a misprint on the map, which was proved by the Canadian Hydrological Survey when they went back out to look in there, and the water's deeper. There's not a scrape on the bottom of the back section of the Edmund Fitzgerald. I saw the entire 170 feet myself. There's not a scratch there. The Coast Guard didn't believe it. The architects said the ship would have sank at Caribou if that's where they hit because it didn't have watertight bulkheads. No one believes that except for one guy. And now the new book that came out on the Fitzgerald is also putting some credence into this nonsense story about a diver who found a rock with paint on it, and it didn't exist. He said that the diver, and I've heard this at many lectures, that this diver found a rock with red paint, but the Coast Guard in Canada told him to shut up about it or they would seek their revenge on him. The Canadian Coast Guard had nothing to do with anything on the Edmund Fitzgerald. So to pretend that somehow they were bullies or wanted to stop, this rock would have been the instant reason that to prove the whole theory that it did run aground, and they're going to say that he sat on it. So all of this stuff has become this just nonsense, on the wreck, but it
Yeah.
sells books and
Mhm.
has no truth to it at all. The rock doesn't even exist. Do you think you would have hung on to the rock that sank the Edmund Fitzgerald? Yeah, I think you would have.
Yeah, that's so comical to be like, what's the point in hiding it? What's the point of like if you got it, show it.
Oh, who's afraid of the Canadian Coast Guard? They literally have 3 shipwrecks that you can't dive. And the Canadians, they said there's $1 million fine if you dive the Edmund Fitzgerald. The recent swim that they did, the recent paddleboard that they did for the families of the Edmund Fitzgerald, all of them asked for permission to do this above the gravesite. You don't need permission to sail over the Edmund Fitzgerald. You don't. It's in a shipping lane. It's not something but out of respect, I think, or almost like a salute to the Canadian ministry to say, may we do this? They still ask for this. To dive it, to put sonar on it, yes, you need a permit to do that. But I'll be honest, the other 2 shipwrecks in Lake Ontario that the Canadian government have locked out, the Hamilton and the Scourge from the War of 1812, there's been divers who blatantly dove it and said, what are you going to do to us? And they did nothing. So with this big, oh, they're going to seize your boat and take all these things. I think if I went out there and did it, but of course, with my luck, they would take everything I owned. But the truth is, it doesn't exist. There's no secret radar system to watch over the Fitzgerald and all these silly rumors that I hear. The Canadian government has trouble with putting out fires, forest fires. They're not spending a lot of money monitoring the Edmund Fitzgerald, but that's become the folklore on all of this. And really, it's the ethical part of it. Should we go down there? My book talks about, it might be within the U.S. border. So the bow of the Edmund Fitzgerald might actually be in U.S. waters, which would have no regulation at all. And the truth is that if that is that way, we could go diving right now. But it absolutely, I don't know if it is, and I don't want to upset family members by going up there. Eventually, we'll find the truth. The Canadian government, or actually the U.S. government, says it's 750 feet across the line. Whether or not that's completely accurate, I don't know, but that's what the official line was from the Coast Guard that I have on paper. Tom Farnquist, that led some of the expeditions or participated, said it's clearly all in Canadian waters. But I've got a sub-pilot that was on his expedition that said it was in U.S. waters. So we'll find out. But should we? Do we want to upset and pick that scab again and make it so, upsetting for family members? I have to keep that in the mix of my excitement to go back, my need to go back. We're not going to solve, any big mysteries that will lead to better safety on the Great Lakes. I can't pretend that. It's just a curiosity, but an intense one that continues to be, today, people talking about it. So you have to put credence in that as well.
Yeah. Wow. Why do you think the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald, we touched on this a little bit. Why do you think it resonates so much with people? Is it the song? Is it
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
2 words, Gordon Lightfoot. Honestly, this is the only reason we're still talking about it. Why don't, if I mention Daniel J. Morrell, why doesn't anybody know about the miraculous survival of Dennis Hale unless you are a big maritime buff? if I mention the Regina or the recent discovery of the James Carruthers, the largest ship still lost on the Great Lakes, it sank in 1913. It was the biggest vessel Canada had ever built. Nobody remembered the James Carruthers until it hit the headlines again. There was no song about it. Gordon did not write a song about any of the 13 victims or the Nova dock from the 1940 storm or the Davik that flipped over or the Minch that was ripped in half and all the crew were lost. So yeah, it resonates because everybody vanished, but mostly because of Gordon's song that is played, continuously now. And really break it down. Incredible lyrics. The melody, the haunting guitar. Terry Clements, a Detroit guitarist that moved to California, that plays that just haunting riff. It's all put together so beautifully over a Irish dirge that Gordon had heard before. He didn't come up with that melody. It was an ancient melody that came out of Ireland. And that whole thing just tied together to become this incredible song. Some people say it's too long, but as a DJ, that's the long songs are where we can use the restroom. So I love the long songs. The 2-minute songs are worthless, but if it's almost 7 minutes long, that's where we finally get a break. And that's probably where I spent most of my DJ time.
That's awesome. Like, oh, great, a long song. I can take a beat here.
And Bye Bye American Pie, same thing. Those were the
Yeah.
two longest songs on the radio until what's the latest one that came out? November Rain came out by Guns N' Roses, and now that's the longest that's on the radio. But yeah,
Yeah.
interesting how we think about that. Beatles songs are only 2 minutes long, and were worthless for bathroom breaks.
Yeah. Hmm. Um, talking of like other wrecks, you mentioned the Jupiter. Like, what are some other wrecks that have just left those impressions on you?
Oh man, everyone that I dive, if the Benwood in California or in Florida, I dove the Hollyhock, which was involved in the rescue efforts for the Carl Bradley, and they later sank it as a fish habitat off of Fort Lauderdale. And when you go down there, and everybody there calls it the Captain Dan, that was named for a diver who got cancer sadly and passed away. They had no idea of the history of this cutter and how it was built, a twin prop cutter out of Bay City, Michigan, and had no idea of the background of what this ship had. Only I had laminated blueprints that I could take down and figure out with all the coral where everything was. Did they figure out that, hey, is this a significant boat? And I'm like, oh yeah, it's a pretty cool vessel. And we now have a new Hollyhock that's sailing on the lakes. So those ones are super interesting to me. Diving even a pile of bones of, a broken ship is incredible to go through and see how the vessel was constructed. They all have incredible stories, and it doesn't need a loss of life to be significant to us. It represents a collision, it represents a fire, it represents a terrible storm. Each one has a backstory, and for me, it doesn't take a lot to get excited about what history is there. But to go to a shipwreck like the Novadoc, where I interviewed two of the survivors and actually touched the steel on the ship, that's an interesting connection to see the Regina upside down and the price, and then to meet the guy who was one of the last ones to see it still afloat. That takes an incredible twist in what we do. The Nordmere, I interviewed in Alabama, the pilot who got the Flying Cross for rescuing the command crew on that ship. That takes on a very special meaning when you visit the bow and realize that's where he lifted them off with his helicopter and brought them to the cutter Mackinac. So any of the ones that I've had a very personal eyewitness connection to, that takes on a very special meaning. But even a pile of bones of the Minnehaha or any of these other wrecks, and to take a grandchild there and to show them and talk about what that means and to see their eyes kind of light up, all of that stuff is super significant to me.
Oh, yeah. The history, the remains, the history of seeing those it's got to be awe-inspiring. I mean,
It is, and when people take things from it, I was very torn when I watched the
mm,
brand new footage from the Carruthers, and they grabbed the running light out of the mud. They started shaking it off, and I'm like, "What are you doing? You have a responsibility when you find a brand new shipwreck to just record where everything is, not to go down there and to touch things and possibly break them or move them or, God forbid, steal something from the bottom, that all belongs to somebody, not you. And just because you spent tens of thousands of dollars in gasoline searching for something doesn't give you the right to that or the right to modify or erase that history of what's down there. So I get very upset. And part of that is being a historian, but part of that is being a grandpa. I want my kids to be able to dive these wrecks, and we don't know where technology is going to go, even for the super deep ones, that they, might be able to see this stuff. Our Great Lakes protect these wrecks. I've seen stumps underwater that are 5,000 years old. This is right after 5,000 years after the giant glaciers were here. So all of that stuff is well preserved in a 200-year-old shipwreck, or even the Griffin that's 300 years old. We know that there's probably still cannons down there or anchors down there because that stuff just doesn't rust away as fast. It eventually will, but we still have a good chance of seeing 300 years of that history as long as we don't destroy it.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I'm sure because it's tough. I mean, I always point out like SeaWorld. It's like I don't think anybody is like SeaWorld is perfect and they're great. But if it inspires somebody to look at the ocean and gets you excited about that, it's like it had value. And I think the same thing for like bringing up a cannon. It's like, does that make you want to go dive and research and find out about these old ships? Like, yeah, but was that right to remove it? That's a really interesting
It is, and, in the
question.
case of LaSalle, who lost the Griffin in the Frontenac, 300 years ago, we found one of his shipwrecks when he came back from France. He actually, followed the Mississippi right to the Delta where New Orleans is now, and named all of that Louisiana for King Louis XIV. When he came back, he couldn't find the Delta, crashed into Texas, lost a ship, and that we found that ship. There were 2 million artifacts on this thing of all the things that they were going to use to build a brand new civilization, of French occupation of what they thought would be Louisiana to protect it against the Spanish. So all this stuff has come up, and it should come up. I mean, this is stuff that was just buried in the mud. But there's other things that, we should be very cognizant about taking. The Lady Elgin had Civil War guns and bayonets and stuff down there. There's a good argument that some of that should come up, but a court case gave it to a man. And now we're starting to see stuff showing up that was illegally came off the bottom,
Hmm.
or gray area at the very best of whether or not it should have. Is it better for the museum? Absolutely. The bell on the Fitzgerald was a good point. They brought it up. I wasn't really excited about bringing it up until now, when I see what it's done for the family members, what it's done for people who openly weep at the sight of the bell. This is a very holy place for them. But it's got to be argued. Maybe it should be at Mariners Church where the Father Ingalls rang the bell the first time. And I say that knowing I'm a board member there. I know what it does, bringing people in. The money that is spent, by people buying to see the bell, goes back into our shipwreck finding. We found dozens of new shipwrecks, and that all becomes another chapter. So I feel that the bell is in a good place, but I'm really worried about people going down and taking stuff and saying, well, it should be on display, especially when we have the new plastic printers that can make replicas pretty well. Does it
Mhm.
have to be the exact one? In some cases, yeah. The Griffith, of a bell that burned in a horrible fire, Griffith with a TH at the end, not Griffin. The Griffith lost 100 people in this fire, and the bell is still burned, and it sits at Toledo's National Museum of the Great Lakes. There's power in that, and I get that. I mean, that's one of those things that you're like, okay, I get it. And it was so close to shore, someone probably would have stole it, and there's merit in that as well. But it's just so gray. I wish there was a correct answer, but I would never get it right. So I'd certainly never, criticize somebody that did. But horsing things out of the mud and just moving things around, yeah, there's some criticism for me on that.
Yeah. And I think it's something that still needs to be talked about because I think it's going to get easier and easier to get to this stuff. I think you're going to have submarine drones not
Yeah.
too long, and probably within the next couple, decades, and just like they could grab pieces. It's like,
Oh,
well, Let's
And
not do
think
that.
about just the price of GoPros have changed what we do. My first camera
Yeah.
was $9,000, and this limits who gets to do it. It was 70,000 to dive the Edmund Fitzgerald in the Delta sub. So it limited who could go. But nowadays you can buy for $400 a robot that'll go down to the Edmund Fitzgerald. So that has to be argued, yes. But the cameras are what they're doing. I think there's less of an interest of taking a piece up if you can record it and show it to
Yeah.
people in high def and with better lighting down there than we'd ever be able to carry, with the new LED lights and stuff. We had a real problem with battery power when we would dive these things. And now, it's all changed. The shutter speed on cameras is that we can see full shipwrecks now where we used to just see one tiny piece. Now the zebra mussel and the quagga mussel cleaning up the water too. Photography is revolutionizing a lot of that. But there's still high priority targets like the War of 1812 ships that have cannons and things that people would take just to collect. And there's always a market for that. We see it on eBay all the time. So that has to be kept in the back of your mind as well. But sealing off those wrecks and just saying nobody can go to them is irresponsible because people will still go. The people who break the law don't care about laws, right?
All right. Hmm. Yeah, if you're there illegally, you're probably going to break a couple more while you're there, right?
Why not? Yeah, let's throw this in and I'll get a piece and probably get my dive trip paid for if I take, even a small piece of one of those racks. And but to tell somebody if I don't take it, somebody else will is ridiculous. You would never walk into a museum and break the glass and say anybody could have done this and then steal, the Mona Lisa or whatever and go, yeah, but somebody else could have done this. But this is the mentality of some of these divers that, oh boy, this will vanish, so I should have it. Like, no, that's not legit in my book.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you bringing up cameras. I was curious about your opinion on this. Um, I've noticed in I always joke that Shark Week is my favorite holiday of the year. Just like I'm one of those people. I really enjoy that kind of stuff. But I've noticed with some videographers and stuff, they'll always show like the guy in the cage and they're acting like it's so intense that the shark is right outside the cage. But there's another guy holding the camera. Like, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, or is that something that you notice as well?
We have brand new technology now that will erase poles that you can put, like you'll see people wingsuiting it, flying, and you look and you go, how are they filming that? No one is filming backwards with a wingsuit on. Those are poles that they can extend out, and then the camera can take out and replace, just like we can erase people in Photoshop. So there's
Yeah.
new technology that allow us to do a lot of that. But the truth is, on some of those stories, and many of the ones that come to the Great Lakes, anything that deal with gold or ghosts or all that other nonsense that comes out when we have so many originally true stories, most of those are pre-written before they even get there. So the
Yeah.
producers already know what they want people to say. I have friends who've been instructed what their quote should be. And to me, that is such a cheat on these programs. But that's what they sold to the producers. That's what the producers sold to the network. And, doggone it, that's what they're going to come back with. And I kind of get that, but I'll never participate in that. If you're going to make something up, if we find something, trust me, you'll get the best quotes. And National Geographic did a whole special with us, and all of it was on the fly, and everything turned out perfect. We saw the steamer that was pulling the Curtis and the Peterson. We found the Curtis was pulling the Marvin and the Peterson. We found the Marvin and the ship. As the robot goes around the ship, we see the name for the first time. All of that is legit. It's organic of us going, oh my gosh, this is the Marvin. It could have been the Peterson. They were very close in size. We didn't know they were loaded with 2x4s that had been cut out of Lance, Michigan. It was incredible. You don't need to replace that, but there's so many of these stupid stories of the guys that wear the fedoras and do the, I need to make sure that we find something, even though it's been discovered, a decade ago. They just want that silliness, that I feel as a producer is more fun making the pieces out of what you found much more than creating a script and doing a movie, if you will, on what we do. So yeah, Shark Week, a lot of that. They know that if they go out and say, oh, we didn't see a shark today, the network's gonna be mad. So they
Yeah.
regenerate all that stuff and they have to put some hype in there. And some of that hype is legit, and 90% of it is not. It's all, and that's why they drive me crazy. I would rather see beautiful shots of my favorite shark is a mako, the
Mm.
blue shark and the cool eyes, and they're super fast. That stuff to me would be a lot more fun. I got to swim with whale sharks when I was in Atlanta and in that giant aquarium. I'd
Yeah.
rather see that stuff. The great white's a neat shark and it's powerful, and I love the jumping shots that they do, but a lot of what they do to get that stuff makes me sad. And with the shipwreck stuff, I know a lot of it's invented as well. And there's been people who have admitted that. And that kills me because these stories are so much more than the host of the show. They're so much more than, our reaction to finding it. The story is what's the truth about this. And that should be the focus, not how, I might cry seeing something that, was tragic, or, I might be scared because it's super deep. Who cares? The people who are on the life raft that survived that, they're the ones that deserve the attention, not me because I'm diving it.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess speaking of survivors, is there any stories that really stand out for you? Like people who have survived some of these wrecks that you've gotten a chance to.
Well, it falls into the Fitzgerald because Frank Mays survived the Carl D. Bradley when it broke. There's always been a mystery on how much it broke. The attorneys immediately have to prove that the shipping company knew that that ship was a problem, or they can't get a multi-million-dollar settlement. And this was honed over years of shipwrecks from 1958 to the sinking of the Cedarville, to the sinking of the Morel, to the Fitzgerald. The same attorney handled all of that stuff. And you see that they have to find that reason. So Mays's story morphed into this. I watched it rip into two pieces, and he believed it. So we decided to rediscover the ship. And he said the Fitzgerald got all the love, got all the attention, the song, but the Bradley faded from memory, except for those people that lost all their loved ones. You're talking about 33 guys dying in Rogers City, and most of them are from this town. So uncles
Mm.
and fathers and grandpas, to go and dig that back up again, a lot of them didn't want to hear it. And there were people that tried to block us. In fact, we were supposed to get a robot to go down from University of Michigan, and it was all set. We were going to use this brand new radar, or this brand new sonar, and a laser system to record, because we had talked to U.S. Steel that had dove the shipwreck with a camera, and they said it's horrible visibility. So we figured out a way to do it. But a letter writing campaign from the people who lost loved ones on there canceled our underwater vessel. And we're like, well, dang. Well, that led to a lawsuit. And we eventually ended up, we put the Delta down there. We brought Frank Mays down there, and sure enough, it was miserable visibility. We almost crashed the submarine right into the shipwreck. So to have that survivor story from Frank, to go down, I didn't get to dive the Bradley, but to have the artist and Fred Shannon and Frank go down there. I swam alongside the submarine when Frank went to go see the Cedarville, another vessel he had sailed on. So all of those connections build just such an incredible story. And now to go and see the new clarity underwater that we didn't have, because the quagga mussel cleared it up. Now we're starting to find out that maybe Frank was wrong. The ship was not in two pieces the way that they described it. And in 97, when they said it was 90 feet apart, that's an absolute fabrication of it's a lie. It's not 90 feet apart. There's a break in the deck. But all of this stuff is coming out from that survivor story. Dennis Hale, I helped publish his book on surviving the Daniel J. Morrell. All of that stuff for me is amazing. And to see the footage that's coming up from 200 feet down, of the bow section is 5 miles from the stern section. Here's a vessel that ripped into two in this big storm, and the stern kept sailing, but not a single person lived through that. All of that is immensely more fascinating to me than the Edmund Fitzgerald. How did that happen? What happened? The mystery, that to me is incredible, way beyond ghosts and gold and all the other nonsense. So all of these survivor stories from 1913, 1940, every one of those stories is amazing. And we're still learning about the Davik. The clarity down there has allowed us to see that the rudder is jammed into the propeller. This was not known for, 60 years. So all this stuff is still kind of slowly coming to the surface, if you forgive the pun. And it still, resonates with the interviews that I've done with these guys who've long since passed away. So if there's any legacy of what I've done, not only putting it together to share with people in books and podcasts and videos, so many videos, it's the fact that it's been preserved. So it's not just, a reporter that might have talked to 2 seconds about it to a survivor who said, glad I made it. Now there's a 2-hour interview, and I'll eventually give all this to the museums, that they're all asking. The Bentley Library in University of Michigan has been so good to me. I'm sure I've already got a collection going there, so I'll eventually turn that stuff over. I just don't want to tune in and have somebody have all my stuff in one of their programs. That would be
Right.
worse than. But eventually, those stories don't belong to me. They're to the ages, and I will eventually give all of that stuff up so that maybe in 50 years from now, someone will have an incredible, not just a written story, but they'll get to see the guy's face and watch the pain of them talking about losing their friends. That is so much more powerful than a written testimony.
Yeah, definitely. So there's some stuff that you have that you just haven't had a place for yet that you still kind of have holding
There's
on to,
some,
or?
and some of it I'm just really worried, with the Fitzgerald coming out, and I'll be honest, you're the only person I've told this to, but I've done, I think, 15 interviews, popular mechanics. I just got back from Wisconsin 2 days ago, filming a special for PBS over there. I'll be going to Duluth, and another film crew is going to meet us in Frankenmuth to do an interview. So a lot of that, I don't give them my newest documentary on the Fitzgerald because I don't want to give them the ingredients for their documentary. That there's nothing sillier than to take 30 years of your life and say, oh, by the way, here you go. This is everything. But excuse me, I'll use my older version so at least they know, and I will point them to where the footage of the Edmund Fitzgerald being built is, and take those big pieces that it took me decades to find and donate some of that. But I won't give up my interviews with these guys and say, oh, yeah, please use this in your piece. I have too much money wrapped up into that to do what? Because it's the 50th anniversary, I'm going to do that. But
Yeah.
eventually, all of that stuff will become public domain. It has to. It can't just stay in my basement. My queen, she wants that thing cleaned out. She go get that stuff out of there. And it should go to somebody a lot more intelligent than I that could go and create something new about it. But I don't want it competing where I'm trying to eke out a little bit of money for my gas tank or my
Right.
retirement fund and stuff. And yeah, so that's a tough call of, will it, when do you give it up? And will I ever do anything more with it? I cannot envision another project with a Fitzgerald. I did 3 documentaries on the Fitzgerald, 1994's expedition, 3 different versions of the Edmund Fitzgerald investigations, and finally Tattletale Sounds came out last year, and it's airing on PBS this year. Um, in my book, I have no more knowledge than that. It's all there, and part of you feels susceptible or vulnerable about giving up that knowledge because of how long it took to give it. But I'm a journalist. That's what you do. You share that knowledge, and it's tough to give it up, but it's also really invigorating to prove some things right, prove some things wrong, and not be challenged. My book's been out for 2 years. You know how nerve-wracking that is to have all these experts that are still alive. Jim Wilson, who investigated the sinking for the Coast Guard, came to one of my lectures. Do you know what that's like? Eh, Having this expert, I'm telling people what I think. That's really tough. It's very vulnerable, but there's something pretty amazing when you get done and they shake their head yes, like, okay. And they learn something too. That's hugely rewarding. And even more so to have a young person come up to me and say, or even an older person now, they work at a museum. They said, hey, I watched your program from 1998 on Deep Six about the 6 largest freighters ever lost. And I wanted to become an archaeologist, or I wanted to become a
Hmm.
marine, a historian. That's hugely satisfying. And I've felt that in so many people. And that's one of the byproducts I never thought I'd see.
Yeah. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, that inspiration, and I'm sure it's so funny thinking about those museums. I'm sure there's people that have seen your clips I was like, oh, I worked at the museum. I saw you every day, you know?
Yeah, I mean, every major museum plays a Mixter video. Bay County
Mhm.
rotates them. There's 5 of them. Canal Park, the most visited maritime museum. It's free to go to. It's right at the mouth of where the ships leave in Duluth. Have played the Fitzgerald now for almost 25 years. So yeah, there's a lot of people that are like, "Oh my God, you're so great." I'm like, I don't see that, but I'm thrilled that I added to the chapter of that, you know.
Yeah.
And the only reason I don't, the earliest documentaries I don't even appear in, but people would look at me and go, "Well, what did you do on that?" Well, I wrote it and I filmed it and I produced it. So I just started to voice everything because it didn't make sense not to have people connect me to my projects the way an author would be connected to a book. So I started doing my own voicing, which, it's tough to do that because there's so many more talented voiceover artists that could do a much better job, better people on camera, but it didn't make a lot of sense to give that part of the term you used was Indiana Jones, to
Mm.
give that up to somebody when, just for why? Because I wanted to have a better voice on it. So I just
Yeah.
became synonymous with my videos because of necessity and cost. It cost me nothing for me to do it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, I don't have to hire a painter if I paint it myself.
Absolutely. There's merit in that.
Uh, well, we talked a little bit about just like how you've done some ocean, you've done some Great Lakes. What are the parallels or what are the contrasts between like wrecks on the ocean versus the Great Lakes?
Almost consistently, it's a captain's mistake, and I hate to say that because I've never sailed. I've been on boats as a guest on the Wolverine. I've sailed on the Alpina, which is the oldest working boat on the Great Lakes, and I've had very nice experiences. I joke about, my when I flew in the B-52 bomber, they wrote in grease pencil on the side of it, 8 experienced Air Force trained people and 1 wannabe. And that's what I've been, has been this wannabe. I'm not an expert on shipbuilding. I'm not an expert on metallurgy or why ships break, but I try to find those experts for everything that I do so that at least I have an informed decision. So much of the stuff that I do vicariously through the people who either survived it or rescued people from it or built the Fitzgerald or did all these things all becomes part of the story, and I'm wonderful that I get to guide people through it, but I never try to pretend that I'm some kind of an expert from that. So that's why I don't blame the captains like, "Hey, this is the whole reason," but ultimately, they're in charge, right? They decide when to go. The Bradley, the Morel, the Fitzgerald, all of our modern freighters were bad captain decisions to go into a storm that their ship couldn't handle. Now, did they know that their ship was had problems? Morale was pretty rusty and it hadn't sailed all year and they were going to just go because the price of steel was good and they ran out and were pulling cobwebs out of this thing. I got to believe that he knew. The Bradley, they knew the captain wrote a note that said, "She's in rough shape. I got to get her into the shipyard." And he still pushed into the storm when other people dropped the hook and stayed out. And the Fitzgerald had been, McSorley had been told by the engineers. The cook told me that the engineer said, "Captain, there's still a problem with the keel." And he said, "It's just got to hold together one more season." So to take the blame off of them is ridiculous. To put it onto a deckhand for not dogging down all the hatches, I think is not correct. But you also have to look at the first mate, who was a captain as well on the Fitzgerald. And the captain told him, "Cut overtime. On Sunday, we're not going to dog all those down." He had ordered no overtime in the kitchen, and that's why the galley cook, Red Bergner, said there were cuts all over the ship, as far as money went. And that was a financial decision. But you also have to say, no, wait a minute. My crew's safety is number one. And we saw that very valiantly in the search for the Fitzgerald, where some of the ships said, "No, we're not going back into that storm to look for people who we can't even, there's been no call for Mayday. We don't know they survived. I'm not going to risk my ship and my crew to do that." And you can't blame them. That's their ultimate responsibility. So captains are almost always, from 1913 all the way up to all of these, the captain made a bad call. And it was usually they didn't understand how bad the storm was going to be, or they didn't understand the problems that their ship had. Other ones are collisions where they're out of the position or they're going full speed in fog that they shouldn't even be riding in, but they trusted their radar, or they trusted the captain and the other ship to make a turn that he thought they should make. So a lot of that stuff, you look and scratch your head now, but these are decisions that are made regularly. You look at how many crashes are on the roads and how many people die on our highways from just bad decisions, and that it should never happen, but it does because people, they drive crazy in bad weather, or they drive crazy just to begin with, and that's where those mistakes are made. And sadly, that's what cost so many people their lives. 25,000 people died on the Great Lakes over the last 300 years.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, man, that's incredible. And then so you'd say the ocean is, I mean, obviously there's captain error as well, but it's more of an element,
Yeah, and
would you say, on the ocean?
I've been lucky enough to talk to, captains who've sailed both, and, the guys that came over from the Coast Guard, Jimmy Hobaugh was one of them that searched for the Fitzgerald, went out with his crew, a skeleton crew, to try to go through the same storm that killed 29 people, and he told me that the waves in the ocean are farther apart, and that you would kind of pitch and yaw, and you would make your way through. He said in the Great Lakes, you pitch and yaw at the same time. It hits off the shoreline, and it's a very confused sea, and that takes a lot of these people that took the lakes for granted. They called them ponds. Even the first pilot to go on the Great Lakes, Luke, who was in charge with Robert LaSalle, just goes and sails, and they get in a big storm off of Alpena, and everybody's on their knees praying to God, please get us through this storm, except for Luke, who's cursing at LaSalle, saying, you brought me to this freshwater pond to kill me when I'm famous for sailing the killer oceans. He felt embarrassed by that. And ultimately, he lost his life. When the ship turned around and went into a big storm on Lake Michigan and vanished, the first guy to sail who did not respect fresh water died on it. So this has been the legend of people coming here. And then the confusion of the shipping lanes from saltwater captains coming to freshwater led to many collisions that put a lot of vessels down as well. So a lot of mistakes, a lot of bad weather. And if you look at the percentage wise, though, it's those fall gales that really take the majority of the ships. And that's just because they get surprised and because they're pushing to try to get that cargo through before winter freeze, when no more cargo can move. So there's that added pressure to get it done.
Mhm. Wow. Yeah, I recently, well, last year I got the opportunity to do some snorkeling in Maui, and so much to look at, so much fish, and people would always joke that the Michigan boy is, really having fun snorkeling, and I was like, yeah, it's not much to look at, Well, it's like, I think that's something that people don't know is like there's so much in the Great Lakes, like,
There is, and I'll tell you the big difference for me is not, well, of course, the coral reefs are beautiful and it's wonderful, but they coat everything. So as soon as something's underwater in the ocean, the woodworms eat all the wood, so it's gone. So, even on the Titanic, there's no skeletons down there because these worms will eat, anything that's organic that way. Um,
mm,
the coral covers everything very quickly, so you can't see World War II wrecks in the ocean. But in the Great Lakes, we dove down and saw, with a robot, the Atlanta, and the sign is still there with gold paint that says Atlanta right on it. When we saw the Marvin that went down in 1914, it still says Selden E. Marvin on the sign, and you can see the caulking in the seams and the 2x4s on deck. There's no quagga mussels, there's no zebra mussels in Lake Superior, deeper parts, and all these wrecks are preserved to the moment that they went down. So it's a big thing that we have to not touch things, record what we can to make sure that that record, that next chapter in that wreck is found. The ocean, the other big change for me is the sound. There's crabs clicking and parrotfish eating, and you can listen and you hear all this noise that is almost overwhelming. In the Great Lakes, you might hear a me like a mosquito, and that's a powerboat going by, or you hear a woof, 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 and that's a giant freighter that might be a mile away because sound travels 3 times better underwater than it does on the surface. So we can hear this, but there's no critters that we hear in the lake, so they're amazingly silent. So totally different environments, and I get enjoyment from ocean because of the incredible fish. I've pet a nurse shark before. I've been underwater and seen eels and crabs and all the just everything's alive. The Great Lakes, especially on the Fitzgerald, it looks like a moonscape on the bottom. There's nothing there but a couple of little tiny sculpins. I saw a burbot or two down there, and that's it. Nothing really resides 500 feet down. It's mostly up higher, in the 100 foot to the surface is where we catch all of our fish. So, down there, not too much to see, and it certainly is a lot different than the ocean. So that's why we have this respect. If these wrecks are this well preserved, some of the best in the world. The Baltic Sea is the only one that even rivals what the Great Lakes have. And I would argue, yeah, they certainly have a lot of, early history and wartime history that would be interesting to see. But we have, French occupation, British occupation, going into the American Revolution, all represented on the bottom, into our wartime ships that we didn't have warfare here other than the War of 1812, but we had commodities, including tankers that went down during World War II, all kinds of stuff that's been lost. We even have a German U-boat in Lake Michigan that was a war prize from World War I that sunk in Lake Michigan. So we have this incredible collection that we absolutely must protect.
Mm. Yeah. And it's cool that like that lake has that opportunity. The Great Lakes have that, and that'll be preserved. And um, so kind of wrapping up our discussion here, how is just like working on these shipwrecks, like how's it shaped the way you think about the Great Lakes, or even just like life and death? Just I know it's a heavy question, but I feel like you've seen a lot.
Yeah, I've seen a lot, and I would have never had to wanted to think about life and death, but I had a heart ablation about 20 years ago, for an arrhythmia. And you think about life and death then. I just got over a brain tumor in July. They took out, and thank goodness it wasn't cancerous. So I do think about life and death, but I never really attached it to, my mortality to the shipwrecks. I've always been more attracted to the survival stories. And it amazes me to have lifesavers like Ben Cameron, who had an alleged 500 to 600 rescues. I've been attracted to stories of the Charles Mixer, which is related to me, which went down into a massive storm in Chicago in 1894. All of the survival stories where lifesavers were involved. My great grandfather, Prudent Dion, or Diane is how we pronounce it, was a lifesaver that saved people in Muskegon right at the turn of the century. And it's an amazing history to look at those logbooks with his name in there, and then take that into all the survivors I've met, the heroic people on cutters and helicopters. All of that stuff builds into my appreciation for that quest for life. I get mad when people say on the Fitzgerald they would have just gone to their bunk and pulled their head under. No, everybody had a warm house to go to and a loved one that was waiting for them. And they would have fought anything to try to get to the surface and try to survive. But it was so quick, mercifully quick, that it was over with and they didn't have to suffer. But most of them would have raced to try to get to a life raft to try to make it, like so many did on the Bradley. The Morel had one survivor, and the Steinbrenner had several people that made it to the raft as well. So those are the stories that attract me. The loss of life, and to have the bell ringings every year have no interest to me at all. And it's not that I put nothing into it. I just feel that those stories have been told so often, and every
Yeah.
year we think about those people who lost their lives. I would rather ring the bell for a lifesaver like Keeper Gray, who went out, rode 20 miles out to save 18 people and two dogs, and then rode 20 miles back and later collapsed, and couldn't do his job anymore and died penniless because we didn't have a pension for
Mhm.
these guys. Ring the bell for him. Ring the bell for Jimmy Hobaugh, who went after, the Fitzgerald crew, or ring the bell for Jerome Kia and all of his crew who were killed off of Michigan's Thumb, going to a shipwreck that didn't even need help, but that was their call, was to get in that boat, crash through the surf and do that. They deserve that bell ringing much more. And I'm not, again, diminishing anybody who was lost on any shipwrecks, but let's be honest, the 29 on the Fitzgerald have had 50 years of a song and everything else. It's time we remember some of the heroes that were out and some of the people that maybe didn't have a song written about them. That to me would have more meaning. And then when people tell me we're going to add a 30th ring for Gordon Lightfoot, I want to rip what's remaining of my hair out, because it's just there's so many other stories of people who deserve that type of respect.
Wow. Yeah.
Gordon made his money on the song, and he will be forever known as the guy tied to the Edmund Fitzgerald story. We don't even talk about his songs about trains, right? But he wrote more of those. But,
Yeah.
he gets his due. He doesn't deserve a bell ringing. But I can give you a list of 150 to 300 people over the last 150 years of the life-saving service in the Coast Guard who much deserve that bell ringing and maybe a song about them.
Yeah. Wow, that's yeah, you never think about that. It's because they're trying to honor, but just man, those rescuers and man, especially being in the museum, you see those stories of these guys that, just they're on call, they're ready to jump in the Great Lakes and just the lack of technology at that time too. It's just like it's go that way, you
Well,
know?
the motto was you have to go out, you don't have to come back. And I asked that to the captain on board the Sundew that went after the guys on the Bradley. Captain Muth, I flew him back from Florida to take a last ride when the cutter was going to be retired. And I brought him up and I said, "Is that your motto? You have to go out." He goes, "Rick, we train to come back." That's ridiculous. That our whole mission is to make sure we come back. And that's true. I was on the dive team for the sheriffs in Saginaw County. You don't jump into rushing water without a life jacket on to save somebody. You try to make it so that you can do this safely. You don't kill yourself to do that. And there's a bigger tragedy in the people that are unprepared who do that. But in many cases, that life-saving service, that was the only hope that they had, for especially the shipwreck coast that goes on the southern side of Lake Superior on the eastern end. There were at one time 5 different stations, 16 miles apart because of how deadly and remote that area was. And that's what those guys did. They jumped in the boat and they went, to rescue them. And we're still finding the ships that were lost that are part of their story. And that's pretty incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. All right. I've got one more question that this is out of left field.
All right.
So brace yourself. Because of involvement in Michigan, Wisconsin, your radio guy, this is something I wanted to ask you. What are your thoughts on the dog man? Are you a believer?
So much of that stuff. I want to believe in Bigfoot,
Mhm.
Dogman. I want to believe in the mysterious light. Is it Pequaming that has it? There's so many books that were written about even the Great Lakes Triangle. And I want to, but the truth is they sell a lot of books, they sell a lot of mythology, and it brings people in, especially Dogman brings people into these cities. My buddy loves the cryptology. Is that what it is? The
Yeah.
study of these monsters and stuff, and he's been to all of the Mothman and all these things. I just find that the true stories, as I go through the log books of all of these life-saving stations of ships that have been long forgotten, I find that so much more incredible to see that,
Definitely.
these little towns like, Deer Park that grew because of a lumber industry and then erased because the lumber company said, "No more trees, we're gone." And they can't get tourism back to these places, whole cities that vanish because they were hinged to that, whole cities that were built, and these stories are all forgotten. So I would much rather spend time telling the story of the Heinz, legacy of the ships that were lost in 1914, the stories of so many of the copper industry where we had copper from Michigan in every penny for 2 years, and why that changed and what happened to Keweenaw's copper and why it was so well regarded around the world. Those stories to me are so much more interesting. Even our first geologist, Doug Houghton, gets a long chapter in my new book, Howling Winds, because I don't think his story was told correctly. And the sad story of him and his dog drowning, while on a mission to log Michigan's counties and townships. That to me is so much more interesting than werewolves and dogs and gold and ghosts. But I catch hell every time I talk to a lighthouse group and I poo-poo any story about a lighthouse ghost and they come unglued. This is
Yeah.
part of the folklore and the truth, and I totally understand it. So I try to stay away from that now. I'm just like,
Yeah. That's awesome. No, I just wanted to ask you because I knew you'd know about it, being involved in all that stuff. It's like, I know you've been asked before.
Mostly the Great Lakes Triangle stuff, where, oh my God, but you see that hinge to the Bermuda Triangle. And it's funny, I see the memes on Facebook now that say, haven't heard much about the Bermuda Triangle in a while. And you're right, it's not
Yeah.
nearly as danger. Or someone wrote, quicksand seemed like it would be a much more bigger danger because every show we watched as kids, someone would get trapped in quicksand. It would all because they
Yeah.
blow this stuff out of proportion.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we all had to have a plan. It's like, well, this is part of growing up is you get stuck in quicksand and
You bet. Here's how we get out of it. I've never seen quicksand. I have hunted a lot. I've been
Hmm.
traipsing through every corner of Michigan. I have yet to fall into quicksand.
Yeah. Well, hey, fingers crossed, right? Awesome. Well, Rick, thank you so much. I'd love to hear just like where people can find you, how can they support you, where can they find your documentaries?
The best thing for me is if you want to support me, go to your local museum. The any local museum with history is worth going to. And we've lost so many ships that people thought would be make great museums, and then nobody went to go see them.
Hmm.
Go to the Lightship in Port Huron. And if you pick up a book from me, all the better. A video from me at any of the museums like Whitefish Point, Manitowoc's museum is incredible, the National Museum of the Great Lakes, and I know I'm leaving out a lot. Bay County, they all have my product. You buy from them, you give half the profit to the museum, which is amazing. And if you cannot get, or God forbid, someone doesn't have my product on their shelf, go to shipwreckpodcast.com or lakefury.com and you can buy it online there as well. But the best is to go to a museum and your local library, support them and let them know that what they have is important because this stuff can all go away with a vote, and it's surprising how many museums are almost shut down by a couple of votes from people who don't think we need to know this anymore. There's nothing like your local museum and you must protect it.
Wow. Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Thank you. We'll link some of those sites and then those places as well for people to go check out.
Awesome.
Yeah. Rick, just thank you so much. Appreciate you taking the time and doing this interview with us. And yeah, just thank you for all your stories and everything you're sharing.
I have a thrill telling them, but to share them with you and somebody who's excited about it, that this is next level. So I appreciate what you do as well, Heath.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
You bet.